Today, we're going to uncover one of the most intriguing and dark mysteries of the past. A mystery that forces us to take a completely different look at what we thought we knew about the early 19th century. The countdown for this global drama begins in 1816, when European civilization faced a unique natural phenomenon, the scale of which is hard to overestimate. This event went down in the chronicles under a name that is terrifying in its simplicity: the year without a summer. And this is not an artistic exaggeration, but a dry statement of fact. The usual summer warmth simply forgot about Europe, and this climate anomaly stretched on for 3 long, agonizing years. Try to imagine the atmosphere of that time. The calendar says June or July, the height of the season that should bring life and prosperity. But outside the window, it is deep winter. Instead of sunlight, snow covered the ground across most of the European continent. The sky was constantly covered with leaden clouds, and the summer months were marked by unprecedented frosts. In Germany, the weather conditions resembled a biblical plague. The cold was accompanied by destructive storms, torrential downpours, and massive hail that destroyed everything in its path. Rivers, overflowing with precipitation, burst their banks. The Rhine flooded huge territories, washing away settlements and destroying communication lines. Switzerland, accustomed to alpine cool, was met in the summer of 1816 with regular and heavy snowfalls that paralyzed life in the mountain valleys. Naturally, under such extreme conditions, agriculture was doomed to total destruction. Crops rotted in the fields or froze before they could even sprout. Food security collapsed instantly. By the end of the summer of 1816, grain prices began a relentless climb, and by 1818, they had skyrocketed more than tenfold. For the majority of the population, this was a death sentence. Europe faced a real, ferocious famine. Exhausted, weakened people were struck by epidemics of typhoid and cholera, mowing down entire families and villages. Against the backdrop of total food shortages and despair, civil unrest began, quickly taking a threatening turn. Mass outrage went far beyond peaceful protests or ordinary riots. City streets were swept by violent pogroms and open looting of food warehouses, stalls, and shops. The struggle for resources was accompanied by violence, arson, and murder. In Switzerland, the situation heated up to the limit. To somehow maintain control over the chaos, the authorities had to introduce a state of emergency and a curfew. It seemed that civilization was collapsing before their eyes. In countries considered bastions of culture and well-being, people were killing each other for a piece of bread. The casualty statistics are horrifying. In small Ireland alone, nearly 100,000 people died from hunger and related diseases in 3 years. In a desperate hope to escape starvation and endless unrest, tens of thousands of Europeans abandoned their homes and possessions. Mass migration began. People fled across the ocean to America, believing that salvation and a new home awaited them there. But they were cruelly mistaken in their expectations. This icy nightmare was not a local problem of the Old World. The climate catastrophe engulfed the entire planet, and what was happening at that time on other continents, from Alaska to Panama, is no less frightening, and the consequences of those events are still felt in world history today. Those who crossed the ocean in desperation, hoping to leave the icy hell behind, were cruelly disappointed. The New World welcomed refugees with the same ruthless climate anomaly they tried to hide from. The North American continent, from the glaciers of Alaska to the tropical Isthmus of Panama, was in the grip of unnatural cold. The summer of 1816 in the American state of Vermont looked like a full-blown winter. Fields that should have been green stood frozen, and farmers watched in horror as their hopes for a harvest vanished under a layer of snow and ice. Just like in Europe, agriculture here was paralyzed, which inevitably led to a food crisis and social tension. The cold made it impossible to grow produce, and famine, like a shadow, followed people on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the climate shift brought threats far beyond low temperatures and crop failures. In 1816, a ferocious epidemic broke out in Bengal, India, which was a direct consequence of weather anomalies. Sharp climate changes triggered a mutation of the cholera bacteria, turning the disease into something much more aggressive and deadly. Absolutely helpless in the face of this new biological threat were not only the locals, but also the well-equipped colonial troops. The British Empire, proud of its military might, suffered colossal losses without a single shot being fired. Almost a third of the British Army personnel stationed in the southern and central states of India did not survive this epidemic. An invisible enemy, spawned by a changed nature, mowed down the ranks of soldiers with terrifying efficiency. Populous China did not escape this sad fate either. For the Celestial Empire, the year without a summer turned into a tragedy. Abnormal cold almost completely destroyed rice crops, the main staple on which the lives of millions depended. The loss of the harvest for the empire meant not just economic difficulties, but massive famine, inevitably followed by disease and internal conflicts. The entire northern part of the globe plunged into chaos. Somewhere, people were freezing. Somewhere, they were suffering from previously unknown diseases. And somewhere, they were dying in internecine wars for resources. The picture emerging is truly apocalyptic. For 3 years in a row, the Northern Hemisphere was in the grip of an inexplicable cataclysm. The cold blocked any attempts to establish life, destroyed the food base, and provoked mass unrest. Naturally, modern people ask the question, what could have caused such a global and prolonged disaster? Of course, in textbooks and encyclopedias, we can find a reassuring and clear answer. Specially trained experts assure us that there is nothing mysterious about this phenomenon, and offer a seemingly sound scientific theory. However, if we cast aside blind trust in authority, and look at the official version a little more closely, armed with logic and facts, it begins to burst at the seams, raising more questions than it gives answers. So, why did the Northern Hemisphere not see a warm summer for 3 whole years, plunging into chaos and despair? The answer to this question, it would seem, was found long ago and recorded in the works of authoritative researchers. According to officially recognized science, there is absolutely nothing mystical or inexplicable in this phenomenon. Nature is appointed the culprit of the global catastrophe, or more precisely, geological processes on the other side of the world. According to the approved version, it was all due to a massive eruption of the Tambora volcano, located on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. The scenario offered to us by climatologists looks like this. There was a massive release of volcanic ash and gases into the atmosphere. The volume of this emission was colossal. About 150 cubic kilometers of rock, turned into dust, soared into the skies. This dense suspension, once in the stratosphere, allegedly created a kind of screen preventing the passage of sunlight. The so-called volcanic winter effect arose, which was felt by humanity over the next few years. The logic here is extremely simple and even appealing in its linearity. If rivers are freezing in Europe and crops are dying, then an eruption in the southern hemisphere is to blame. This version is considered quite plausible and generally accepted, even despite one very curious historical nuance. The fact is that the explanation itself appeared much later than the events described. The year without a summer began in 1816, but the cause of this disaster was found and formulated only more than 100 years later, in 1920. It was then that American climatologist William Humphreys linked the Indonesian volcano and the European frosts. That is, the contemporaries of the catastrophe had no idea what was killing them. And only a century later did science retrospectively put everything in its place. In principle, one could agree with this time gap. In the early 19th century, science, and meteorology in particular, was still in its infancy. scientists of that time certainly did not have a complete understanding of global atmospheric processes and the circulation of air masses. Therefore, it is quite natural that the explanation came later, with the development of technology and the accumulation of knowledge. However, the problem lies in the fact that Humphrey's version, put forward in the 20th century, upon detailed examination looks not like rigorous scientific proof, but like an attempt to force a square peg into a round hole. The American researcher claims that the ash thrown up by the Tambora volcano in Indonesia, that is, in the southern hemisphere, caused a winter effect exclusively in the northern hemisphere. And here, in this seemingly sound theory, a fundamental contradiction begins to show. They are trying to convince us that a giant cloud of dust behaved not as a passive participant in atmospheric processes, but as a sentient being with a clear plan of action and navigation equipment. The version sounds logical right up to the moment we open the global map of winds and start analyzing the physics of the process. That's when it turns out that volcanic ash, contrary to the laws of nature, made an impossible journey, ignoring half the globe in order to freeze specific regions. A careful analysis of the theory of American climatologist William Humphreys reveals not just minor inaccuracies, but fundamental contradictions with atmospheric physics. Let's break this moment down in detail. According to the official version, the source of all troubles was the Tambora volcano. It is important to remember a geographical fact. This volcano is located in Indonesia, that is, in the southern hemisphere. During the eruption, a gigantic amount of ash was indeed thrown into the atmosphere. However, this ash, according to historians and climatologists, caused a volcanic winter exclusively in the northern hemisphere. Here arises a logical dead end that confuses anyone who is even slightly familiar with the global circulation of air masses. The ash was thrown into the sky of the southern hemisphere, but the consequences hit Europe and North America. Meanwhile, the southern hemisphere itself, where the catastrophe occurred, suffered no significant climate changes. We get a completely fantastic picture. Millions of tons of volcanic dust rose into the air, but instead of dispersing according to the wind rose or remaining in their latitudes, they purposefully rushed across the equator. This claim directly contradicts the global map of winds. Atmospheric currents are not chaotic movement, but a complex yet orderly system. If a volcano spews ash in Indonesia, the air currents of the southern hemisphere should have spread this suspension right there. It is extremely unlikely and practically impossible from the point of view of atmospheric aerodynamics for ash to migrate in a dense mass for thousands of kilometers to the north, concentrating exclusively over the territories of the USA and European states. Nevertheless, experts still rely on a version from a century ago, effectively agreeing with the idea of intelligent ash. They offer us to believe that volcanic dust miraculously grouped together, overcame equatorial barriers, and hung as a dense screen blocking sunlight only over specific Western countries. At the same time, the climate of the southern hemisphere, which should have suffered first, remained untouched. Such selective behavior of a natural element looks at least suspicious, and at most like an attempt to fit an unsuitable scientific explanation to a historical fact. It looks as if the dust possessed a collective mind and a map marked with targets for freezing. However, even if we assume the incredible and believe that air currents could indeed transport all the ash from south to north, an even more glaring oddity remains in this story. It does not concern wind direction or particle physics. The main paradox is that on the map of the northern hemisphere, which was supposedly entirely covered by a volcanic blanket, there remained one giant white spot. A huge territory bordering freezing Europe, which this global catastrophe miraculously and inexplicably bypassed. And this enchanted place is the Russian Empire. The most paradoxical thing about this tangled climatic story is that the global catastrophe, which allegedly covered the entire northern hemisphere, unexpectedly stumbled upon the borders of the Russian Empire. While Western Europe and North America plunged into icy darkness and their populations died out from hunger and disease, a completely different, almost idyllic picture prevailed across the vast expanse of Russia. The year 1816 passed for our country as if no volcanic eruption and subsequent winter existed at all. The contrast between dying Europe and prospering Russia of that time looks so fantastic that it is hard to wrap one's head around. While it snowed in Berlin and Paris in the summer and rivers were fettered by ice, the Russian climate demonstrated enviable stability. The summer was warm, sunny, and favorable for agriculture. Peasants calmly went out into the fields, which were neither flooded nor frozen out, and gathered abundant harvests. Rye and wheat, instead of rotting on the vine, filled the barns, and surplus grain was actively exported. Moreover, according to the assurances of the same climatologists and historians, the average annual temperature in the Russian Empire in the ill-fated year of 1816 was even higher than the statistical average. That is, while the world was freezing, Russia was warming itself under the rays of the sun. If we follow the official volcanic theory, we have to admit that the ash in the atmosphere possesses not only navigational abilities, but also political intuition. It turns out that these microparticles possessed a kind of collective intelligence. They purposefully accumulated over Europe and Scandinavia, creating an impenetrable screen for sunlight. But at the same time, were panic-stricken about crossing the state border of Russia. The volcanic cloud apparently respected the sovereignty of the empire and stopped exactly where the domains of European monarchs ended. In Europe, cold, hunger, and death. But literally across a conditional borderline, in Russia, warmth, satiety, and prosperity. Of course, if we cast aside the ironic theory of intelligent ash, we are faced with a flagrant violation of the laws of physics. With the constant circulation of air masses, the weather in neighboring regions cannot differ radically for 3 years in a row. It is impossible to imagine a cyclone carrying Arctic cold hanging over Germany but never once touching the European part of Russia. Air knows no borders, and the atmosphere is one. However, the official version insists on precisely this development of events, a selective apocalypse that spared one specific empire. It would seem that one should only rejoice at this. God or nature saved the country from disaster. But it is here, against the background of external well-being and satiety, that a sinister oddity begins to emerge. It is logical to assume that in conditions of a stable climate and good harvests, life in the country should be calm and measured. However, the actions of the authorities during this prosperous period did not fit at all with the picture of peaceful prosperity. Instead of enjoying the calm, processes began inside the country that more resembled preparations for a total war against their own people or a brutal occupation of territories. If the climate was fine and the enemy was not at the gates, then why did the government need to take measures of unprecedented cruelty towards its own citizens? To understand the true state of affairs in the Russian Empire of that period, it is necessary to distract ourselves from meteorological reports and immerse ourselves in the study of one of the most controversial administrative decisions of that era. We are talking about the creation of so-called military settlements. Official historiography presents this as an economic reform aimed at optimizing army maintenance costs. However, the methods by which this optimization was carried out cast doubt on the peaceful intentions of the state. The system began to be introduced as early as 1810, but it reached its apogee and mass distribution precisely in those years when the rest of the world was struggling with climatic chaos. The essence of the plan looked, on paper, quite rational. Military units were transferred to self-sufficiency. Soldiers were supposed to combine combat service with farming, providing themselves with food. It would seem that the state found the ideal formula. The army does not need to be fed at the expense of the treasury. There is no need to spend huge funds on salaries and the construction of barracks. But the devil, as always, is in the details of implementation. For the deployment of regiments, they chose not empty wild lands that needed to be developed, but the most fertile and, critically, already densely populated and inhabited territories. The first testing ground was the Mogilev province. Local residents who had cultivated this land for centuries, built houses, mills, and established households, were not asked if they wanted to host military lodgers. They were simply evicted. Peasants were ordered to leave their allotments and go to distant lands in undeveloped territories. In fact, people were deprived of all acquired property, dooming many of them to death during forced resettlement from cold, hunger, and hardship. Soldiers occupied the vacated villages with ready-made warm houses, cultivated fields, and established infrastructure. This was not the construction of a new life. It looked like the seizure of ready resources. The state did not have to build a single new building for the military. They simply occupied someone else's. In cases where local residents remained, they turned into a disenfranchised labor force, subject to strict army regulations. Life in such settlements was regulated to the smallest detail, turning everyday life into endless barracks drill. If you look at this process without bias, casting aside the term reform, a picture emerges that painfully resembles the actions of an occupying army in captured territory. An armed force arrives, kicks the indigenous population out of their homes, takes away supplies and land, establishing its own harsh order. This looks more like classic colonization or the suppression of conquered lands than the internal reorganization of the armed forces in a peaceful and well-fed time. After all, let us recall, according to the official version, prosperity and record harvests reign in Russia at this time. Why then would the state go to such extreme, inhumane measures, provoking the hatred of its own people? The degree of determination of the authorities in this matter is frightening. Emperor Alexander I himself, whom historians love to call the Blessed, uttered a blood-curdling phrase regarding the implementation of this system. He declared that military settlements would be established at all costs, even if it meant paving the road from St. Petersburg to Chudovo with corpses, and that is 100 kilometers. The Russian Tsar speaks of his native country and subjects with the cruelty of a foreign invader ready to walk over bodies to achieve a goal. Such rhetoric and such actions simply do not mesh with the picture of a prosperous empire enjoying a warm summer. This discrepancy leads to the thought that perhaps we are dealing with a grandiose falsification of chronology, and the events of those years developed quite differently from what is written in textbooks. A careful comparison of events taking place in different parts of the world in the same time period leads us to amazing conclusions. Let's look at the map of 1816 again. In Western Europe, chaos reigns, caused by climatic collapse. Cold, hunger, social disintegration, and population extinction. At the very same time, across the vastness of the Russian Empire, a process is taking place that, in scale and organization, resembles a major military operation, although officially the country is not at war with anyone. We are talking about the active and brutal military colonization of its own lands. The facts speak for themselves, and the chronology of troop movements looks impressive. In the autumn of 1816, when Europe was freezing, a battalion of Count Arakchev's Grenadier Regiment was transferred to the Novgorod province. A whole region was effectively removed from civil administration and handed over to the military. In April 1817, an infantry regiment was stationed in the Mogilev province. 3 regiments of a Ulan division were quartered in the Sloboda Ukraine province. The process grew like a snowball. By the end of Alexander I's reign, 12 grenadier regiments and 2 artillery brigades were settled in the Novgorod province alone. 16 cavalry regiments settled in the Kherson and Yekaterinoslav provinces. Studying Russian documents of those years, we encounter a striking dissonance. Reports from officials and military dispatches report anything and everything. Peasant riots refusing to go into bondage. The secret sale of wine in settlements. corporal punishment for violating regulations. But in the documents for 1816 and 1817, there is not a single mention of a global cooling that destroyed the harvest. While Europe was fighting for survival under the snow, the Russian bureaucracy was concerned only with suppressing internal unrest and setting up new garrisons. How do we reconcile these two realities? On the one hand, a West dying of cold. On the other, an empire that, instead of saving freezing neighbors or protecting against a climatic threat, is engaged in an aggressive redistribution of property within the country. To explain this historical paradox, only one bold version suggests itself, capable of reconciling the contradictions. Perhaps the entire chronology of events of the early 19th century was artificially distorted or shifted. Let's propose a hypothesis in which the so-called year without a summer, and the horrors accompanying it, happened not in 1816, but significantly earlier, say around 1805, or even in the late 18th century. A real planetary catastrophe occurred. The climate did change, causing widespread famine and population decline. Then, a decade later, when the peak of the disaster had passed and the planet began to thaw, a stage of redistributing the emptied world began. Those very military settlements and mass migrations to America are not events parallel to the catastrophe, but its direct consequences, but already in the recovery phase. In such a model of history, 1816 becomes not the year the disaster began, but the year total cleanup and appropriation of territories commenced. Major players who preserved resources begin to seize lands left without protection, be it North America, Africa, China, or, in our case, the internal provinces of Russia and the Caucasus. The army enters not flourishing villages, but territories weakened by the previous cataclysm to establish a new order. The year without a summer in the Chronicles could have been specially shifted in time to mask the true causes and scales of the redistribution of the world that took place in the early 19th century. If we admit this chronological shift, then all the absurdity of the situation disappears, and the scattered puzzles of history finally begin to form a single, albeit frightening, picture. Putting all the scattered fragments of this historical mosaic together, we get a completely different picture of the past, one that is frightening in its rationality. If we refuse blind faith in official dogmas and try to build a logical chain of events, then the scenario of the early 19th century appears before us as a chronicle of a global civilization reset. The theory of intelligent ash, which miraculously chooses victims according to political maps, crumbles to dust, giving way to the cruel but understandable logic of survival and power redistribution. Imagine an alternative course of history that explains all the inconsistencies. First, perhaps in the first decade of the 19th century, a real planetary catastrophe occurs. It doesn't matter if it was the fall of a celestial body or a series of massive eruptions, but the result was the same. The climate changed everywhere. That very cold set in, entailing mass famine, epidemics, and a colossal population decline worldwide. State institutions weakened, vast territories were depopulated, infrastructure fell into decay. It was a period of chaos and silence. Then, a few years later, the climate began to stabilize. The ice retreated, the sun began to warm the earth again, and an era arrived that we know as the warming. It is at this moment that the surviving centers of power, be it European monarchies, the American government, or the Russian autocracy, begin a massive expansion. They need to regain control over territories whose resources were left without protection. A global redistribution of the world begins. In this paradigm, the colonization of the Wild West in America, the active seizure of colonies in Africa and Asia, as well as the creation of military settlements in Russia, are links in one chain. This is not the development of new lands, but the reoccupation of old territories that lost their population. Governments send troops not for parades, but to reassert their power on lands that became effectively no man's land, or poorly defended after the catastrophe. The Russian army, occupying houses in the Novgorod or Mogilev provinces, acts not as a reformer, but as a force filling a power vacuum. The cruelty of Alexander I and his readiness to walk over corpses become understandable. In the conditions of a post-apocalyptic redistribution of the world, sentiments are inappropriate. There is a struggle for the survival of the state and control over resources. In this context, the year without a summer of 1816 becomes a brilliant historical smokescreen. The official version about the volcano and temporary cooling serves as the perfect cover for processes of global property redistribution. By writing off the devastation, hunger, and social upheavals as a rampage of nature and a weather accident, the authorities hid the true scale of the preceding catastrophe and the cruelty of the subsequent seizure of territories. It is much more convenient to explain population decline by bad weather than to admit the fact of a global cataclysm that nearly destroyed civilization. Now that this alternative map of events is unfolded before you, you only have to make a choice. On one side, we have the official version, with ash that violates the laws of physics, flies along selective trajectories, and fears Russian borders. On the other, a logical, albeit cynical, story about a catastrophe, followed by a brutal redistribution of the world by the powers that be. Ask yourself a question. What seems more real to you? Magical meteorology working to please historians, or immutable human nature striving for power and control at any cost? The answer to this question may forever change your perception of the history we were taught in school.